And now it's time for Egg Geek Speak with
GK Technologies,
Sarah and Jody.
In the fields again, I just can't wait to get in the fields again. The life I love is spreading potash for my friends, and I can't wait to get in the fields again. No, I can't wait to get in the fields again.
Welcome back to Egg Geek Speak. We are very excited today to have Dr. Dave Franzen from NDSU, who in June of 2024 will have been at NDSU for 30 years, which is very exciting. And in his career, and he was working in agriculture prior to being at NDSU, and was at the forefront of a lot of things happening in precision agriculture. So today, Jody and I are going to visit with Dave Franzen. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dave.
Yeah, it's a treat. Thank you.
So why don't we get started? Tell us about the beginning of your career. You know, I think a lot of the people in North Dakota, northern Minnesota really know you from academia and the work that you've done at NDSU. But where did you actually start? Because you were in agriculture before you were in academia.
Yeah, I was. It was a little bit of a road. So I didn't come from a farm. I had an uncle that farmed, but everybody had an uncle that had farmed back in the 50s. I didn't get really interested in soils and in agriculture until I got into college at University of Illinois. So my high school intention was to get a degree in chemistry at University of Illinois, and I didn't know, but it is true that University of Illinois has one of the top 3 chemistry departments in the entire country. Some of the Ivy League schools, I think, or maybe 1, 2, 3 anyway, but they changed places. I didn't know that. But so I started out in chemistry and very, very quickly learned that I really didn't want to run around with a lab coat all the time. So I joined the forestry department, who had been inundated by 10 times more students than they normally had, because at that time there was no Department of Natural Resource Sciences, and EPA had just started, and so there was this awareness of nature and the environment and protection and all this kind of stuff. And so the only home that these students had that had an interest in it was to zoom into forestry. It's the only thing that they could think of, trees, environment, I guess that's what they were thinking. So the department didn't know what to do, because they usually had maybe 8 or 10 incoming freshmen. There's a national forest in the southern edge of Illinois, and so their people normally would go there and work, I suppose. But so they opened it up they said if you take about 3 core courses on campus and then go to their 8 credit summer camp, it started out in northern Wisconsin near Ashland, and then the remaining time was near Ely, Minnesota by the Boundary Waters. Then you could take anything else that you wanted. They didn't care. It would just count toward your graduation. So it was great. So I went into it, and 99 other freshmen went into it. And so I one of their required courses, I guess, was agronomy, I think, and in that suite of things that they talked about in Agronomy 101 was they had a soil pit, and I got in it, and there was biology and physics and math and all the biochemistry, everything right in the one pit. And I said, that's it. And so I started taking all the soil courses I could possibly take. I needed money my senior year, and so I started working for Fred Welch, who's a soil fertility person at the time at Illinois, and I helped him with his books, and I helped him in the field, and he offered me a master's, and so I took it, and so I got my master's in 76, and started working at a fertilizer location north of Champaign, about 20 miles or so. And so that was the start of my first career. I worked there about 18 years. I started out just as an agronomist. They had an associated soil lab. Illinois just has a history of supporting independent soil laboratories, like AgVice, but on a way smaller scale. We would normally do anywhere from 10,000 to 20,000 samples a year, PK, organic matter, we had the ability to measure salts, but there aren't any salts in Illinois. So I think I used it twice. And then very shortly, about 1980 or so, after I worked about 4 years or so, the person that was managing the place had a meltdown and in a particularly horrible spring. And so I just managed the whole thing. There were 6 locations, and so I bought all the chemicals and worked with all the reps, and it took care of all the problems. And I took the soil samples. We'd also contract for soil sampling with other companies, and so I worked all the way to almost the Wisconsin line and down south almost as far as Effingham. So took hundreds of thousands of samples during my first career.
What was soil sampling like back then? Was that all composite sampling, or was there gridding and zoning out of those fields at that time?
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, that whole idea comes into my how in the world I ended up in the precision ag realm anyway. Is that in 1929, a couple of University of Illinois people wrote a circular about how to sample for Lyme application. You can imagine in the 20s what Lyme application was like. It had already been identified really early in the 1900s as being a reason that people were leaving southern Illinois because the soils were becoming acid and they just weren't productive anymore. And so people just move away, and I don't know, hundreds of thousands of acres are just vacant. And so then Cyril Hopkins, who wrote a little circular called Bread from Stones, worked with, I don't know, he's kind of a researcher extension person. But anyway, he was a great proponent of limestone, and fortunately for Illinois, limestone is the base bedrock of almost the whole state. Where I grew up near Joliet, near Chicago, limestone just comes to the surface, and so everybody has a quarry next door. Our closest quarry where I worked was maybe 15 miles away or so, and had pretty good quality ag lime. So, anyway, they developed the circular, and what they did is that when you look at the circular, I was amazed because without any research behind them, they just intuitively went to about a sample an acre and just surface 0 to 6 inch sample. Doesn't really specify multiple cores, but I can't imagine they just use one core. So they probably use multiple cores in that situation. They had most of the samples were that shallow 0 to 6, and then some were deeper, and I can't remember what the depth was. And I'm not sure why they did it deeper. I don't know. I think they just wanted to make sure that there wasn't high lime close to the surface. So anyway, if you can imagine what limestone application was at the time, horse-drawn wagon or an old clunky little pickup truck that maybe could hold 2 ton. So you go to the railroad yard and you shovel the stuff into the wagon by hand. Then you go to the field, and there is no automatic spreader, so you just shovel the lime out of the back. It only take maybe about 2 trips to the terminal for me to figure out, really, do I really need lime in this whole field, or can I just do part of it? And so that was the incentive for the grid sampling, and so it became part of the Illinois psyche. So when I started in '76, the grid was 11 samples per 40 acres. So on the west side, let's picture a 40-acre square field. On the west side, there'd be 4 samples in a line because there was no GPS, and so you had to follow the row, or else you'd get lost, right? And so you just count steps. And then in the middle would be 3, and then on the right side there were 4. So I got to know Ted Peck quite a bit. He was the University of Illinois professor that they didn't have a state lab, but they did have what would you call, he was kind of the ad hoc leader of the Illinois Soil Testing Association at that time. And so they were the standard lab. So they actually helped a lot of labs set up, and including mine in Dewey. He helped set that lab up, and he set up many others across the state, all using the Bray test and the ammonium acetate test for potassium and the slurry method for the pH. And so he set all that up, and then we would send samples in. I can't remember, every 2-3 months, something like that, just to make sure that we were on track. He had standard soils that he shared with everybody. We paid certain amount for the service, and kind of like you do with the NADP and Bob's lab in Colorado.
Ted Peck doing that?
Yeah, so Ted Peck was a person that, and that was his main function in Illinois, really. I mean, he had a research appointment and he did a little bit of research, but he did some remarkable research actually, but he never really published all that much. He was a very learned person, but they didn't have the drive to publish, 10 articles a year or something like that a lot of people suffer through right now. So that was kind of his job, was the certification. That's it, the certification entity for Illinois. So I worked with him, and so I was talking to him, and he says, I just can't justify that 11 samples for 40 acres. He says, I don't know where that comes from, and it doesn't make any sense to me. So he was going to move to 2.5 acre grid, and this was in the mid 80s. And so that's what it did. So back to your question, the 11 samples for 40 or the 16 per 40, the 2.5 acre grid, all of those were analyzed separately. Each one of those points was a mini composite of about 5 6-inch soil cores, and then all put through the grinder, and then all tested. And so when you at the end, after the mid 80s, you get 40 acres, you have 16 values, and then usually what you did was just average those, and that average value is what you base the fertilization of the 40 acres on. And I don't know how many people, I don't know if anybody did this, but I certainly did it. So sometimes even at that point there was consolidation of farms, and so and Illinois had a livestock history, not so much anymore, but they certainly did years ago when people just farmed a quarter section. And so you get a sample or two that maybe had a P test about 10 times higher than anywhere else. So you would throw that out and then average the rest of them and then fertilize the field. But it wasn't, that 2.5 acre grid was developed to support the central tendency of the field, not to support precision ag.
That's interesting.
So if I'm getting this right, it was more to help, because even though these 11 samples or these 16 samples later for 40 acres were collected as individual samples and analyzed as individual samples, they were all averaged together at the end to come up with an average rate for the field.
Yeah. And one of the incentives for practical, successful variable rate application of fertilizer in the United States actually came from farmers. Even though they fertilized one rate across the field, they knew already that their fields varied quite a bit because of each sample being analyzed separately. So no surprise to me that it started in Champaign County, because people already knew that things were variable. And I had people ask me for a decade before it actually became, is there any way that we could fertilize these areas of the field separately? And I tried a couple times, but it was very hard. It was pre-GPS and even pre-radar. You'd put out flags, and then you'd have to trust your driver in order to figure out what a red flag was and the yellow flag, and trying to see it with the residue and stuff. It just, it's not impossible, but holy cow. I mean, instead of doing maybe 200 acres in the morning, the poor guy would struggle just to get 80 acres. I mean, didn't do that many. I think I only did that twice. And then after that, when somebody asked me, I said, well, no, we can't do that anymore. No, we can't do that. So,
well, and at that time you were managing the fertilizer plant, right?
Yeah.
When that was coming in. And so you're trying to make business decisions about logistics as well, and getting across, doing what's agronomically correct for the farmer, but also trying to make it logistically work, because obviously you got to keep that spreader going out there too, right?
That's right. Yeah. In the fall, not quite so busy, but it's still kind of busy. And but in the spring, it would have been totally impossible. No way in the world I would ever tackle it in the springtime. after the ground got fit, you had tickets stacked about 6 inches high within about 3 hours, and he struggled to keep everything moving in the field, and mechanics taking off for the weekend, and holy cow. So yeah, I don't miss that at all. So in '89, Illini FS, our main competitor in the county, decided that they would go to variable rate, and that was a really interesting time because the Terragator people, the Ag Chem company, Al McQuinn was the president. He was a really close friend of my boss, and they were like two peas in a pod. I mean, they thought alike. My boss ended up buying the third manufactured Terragator in the United States, well, in the world, I guess, and they were brown. They had brown cabs, which is really pretty ugly, And I actually have a picture of a brown of it, in my Lyme presentation.
If that doesn't scream like 1980s, I don't know what does.
Yeah. Well, their competitor, they had two big competitors in the flotation fertilizer business. They had Big Wheels, which is in Paxton, Illinois, which was just 10 miles down the road from where our location was. Jerry Widmer, I think, was the person that started that. It was just a truck with big wheels. And then, but they were cheaper than the Terragator, you can imagine, because they're just modified trucks. And then Big A was the other competitor, and they were yellow, and they were a tricycle type of a thing. And so I think that the Ag Chem people just didn't want to have the same color as the Big A. They wanted to stand out in the countryside. But it wasn't too long before they decided that brown really wasn't a really attractive color, and so they went to the yellow or the gold after that, and the black and the white. So anyway, so Line AFS got one of the first variable rates in the country, maybe the first one, I don't know, and they made a big splash, but they had trouble with the electronics on the unit talking to the computer. Big programming challenges and some mechanical problems, and Terragator made it, but their support was pretty slim. They just thought it would work, and it didn't. So John Mann, who's still around someplace, I'm not sure where, it's Mann with two N's. He was the one that was struggling trying to get it to work, and they pretty soon called in a big time programmer from their main office in Bloomington, Illinois, and he kind of worked it out so that the application unit could talk to the computer, could talk back to the application unit to kind of make everything work. And the other thing about their program was that they used a 5-acre grid. So when I first found out, I told people that, what do you think about this? That's not going to work. I mean, I've been taking 2.5-acre grids for 5-6 years at that point, and I said there's times when I don't even think the 2.5-acre grid is really telling me what's going on. Walking through the crops, I did a lot of sampling in the summertime, which advice is starting to get people to do, which is a good idea for P and K, as long as you're doing it at the same time of the year every year. pH, change a whole lot within a calendar period of time. So I did a lot of that, and so I'd walk across a field and I'd see corn that was tall and corn that was short, and it wasn't all nitrogen. It was other things going on there, you could tell. But I was loyal to my steps, and because when I talked to Ted Peck, he said, well, you can't really introduce bias in it. The whole idea that we're doing the grid and doing it a certain amount is to eliminate bias from it and just to make sure that it's a strategically random sample. I don't know what you would call it, anyways. But it 5-acre grid is I couldn't even imagine. But they were doing it because of the cost. I think I'm pretty sure it was because of the cost. And so when I found out, okay, so I was pretty sure that my boss was going to sell the place at some point, because he told us he always wanted to own a place where somebody could wax whatever he was selling. And it was really hard to do with fertilizer. Once you throw it out in the field, there's really kind of there. And yeah, so he wanted something a little bit more substantial, and the fertilizer business had been very, very good to him, but I don't know, he's getting tired of it at that point. He's the ultimate entrepreneur. So I kind of looked around, had a master's degree, but in order to kind of do the same kinds of things, or at least, the same caliber of things that I've been doing, I figured I needed a PhD. So at that time, it just so happened that Ted Peck was looking for a PhD grad student to work on a project that was started out in the 60s by a colleague of his, which I'll remember here in a minute. He was actually a native of North Dakota at one time, up by Grand Forks, Icelandic community up there.
By Mountain and Garter in that area?
Near Park Rapids, north of there.
Park River? Yep.
Yeah, Park River, that's what I
Yep.
mean. Yeah, up just north of that a little bit. So he came from that. Sig Melstead, that was his name.
Melsteads. That's a good Icelander name from that neck of the woods.
There you go. Yeah, so he was in the Army in World War II and was on Omaha Beach on D-Day and went all the way to Germany. And then when he got out, he did the GI Bill and ended up at Illinois. Was there for quite a while. And so anyway, he started this grid sampling work in the late 60s on a 40-acre field near Mansfield, Illinois, which is about 40 miles west of Champaign, and then one just north of Urbana, which eventually got swallowed up by the city. So Ted Peck came out of Wisconsin and started his career and started working with SIG and continued that work. They didn't do it every year, but periodically they go out there and they sample these fields in an 80-foot grid because that was a division. Let me see. Was that 16 rods? Something to do with rods. Anyway, 256 samples for a 40-acre field. And starting in the early 80s, 82, something like that, SIG had pretty well backed away way before that. But Ted decided this was very important. And so he picked up a field near Thomasboro that the University of Illinois actually owned, 40 acres there, and kept on working with the Mansfield field. So he had multiple years, many years of grid sampled 80-foot grids, PK, pH. And so he wanted somebody to kind of tie a ribbon around that and tie it off with a bow. And so that was one of my choices. And the other choice was to work with Bob Haft, who was extension soil specialist, and he was at my master's committee in the 70s. But he worked on nitrogen almost exclusively and was frustrated more than a little bit that some of the sites where he had N-rate trials on, he got no response. Their yields were good, but he just didn't get any response. He couldn't figure out why. It didn't really seem like it was a history of manure or anything. It just, for some reason, it just wouldn't work. So he worked with Richard Mulvaney, who's still there at Illinois, and that's when Richard was working on that Illinois soil nitrogen test, which made a splash back in the early 90s or something like that. Anyway, so that was plot work, and I didn't figure that my boss would go for that at all. But I figured that with Ted's work that I could take a couple days off in the spring, couple days off in the fall to do the sampling, kind of front load my courses. So I went to my boss and I said, I'll continue to work 40 hours a week with you, but I need time off to take the courses, and I need some time to do the field work, and then the lab work I'll just do at nights, weekends, holidays, whatever. So he was trying to get his son into the business, but his son didn't I don't know, he would rather hunt and fish than work, and as long as I was around to defer to, he was more than happy to defer to me. So I said, if you want to know, if your son is going to do this or not, you need to get me out of the picture. I'll be there almost every day in order to put out fires or whatever. So he agreed, and exceptional for him really was that he didn't like it after maybe the first year, but he stuck it out, and I graduated in 4 years my PhD. And at that point, it was very clear that his son really wasn't going to take charge of it, and it was very clear to me that he was going to sell it. So I started looking around, and that's when this happened. But my PhD work was tying that together, and found out at the end of it that it needed to sample an acre. You needed to sample an acre to figure out those patterns.
I just want to point something out because this is something that's actually, I think, really cool about your career. So you were actually working full time at the fertilizer place while you're pursuing your PhD. You got your PhD done in 4 years at the same time. I mean, that I can't imagine that there were very many people at that point in time actually working and getting a PhD at the same time.
I don't know anybody, and I've talked people out of it since. And then my wife and I had been married for 15 years, and it was pretty clear because of a medical condition that she was not going to get pregnant. And so we just decided to be everybody's more, a little bit wealthier aunt and uncle. And then the week that I was accepted into grad school, she turns up pregnant.
Oh my goodness gracious.
So, people had asked me, how's it going? And I said, well, I haven't flunked out of school. I'm still employed and I'm still married.
That's an accomplishment.
I spent, I commuted back and forth. I bought a Geo Metro, and it was a very sad day because we traded in our unbelievable 86 Camaro for a Geo Metro and a Chevy Lumina. It was a very sad day. It was really sad. But I put almost 100,000 miles on that thing. I'd start out in the morning and at school, maybe do an 8 o'clock, zoom back to the office, 20 miles, and put in whatever I needed, and then maybe I'd have an afternoon class or two, and I'd go back there, and then I'd come back to work for a few hours, and then I'd go back because I'm an idiot, and so I decided since I'm using geostatistics in order to map this thing and do kriging and all that, I needed to understand it, and so I took physical chemistry, which was a requirement, but I also took linear algebra at the same time. Taught by a recent Harvard graduate who did nonlinear calculus, and so it was I had to relearn calculus, and so I did that until midnight, then came home and got some sleep, and then did the whole thing over again. Luann said if I ever took 2 courses or required that much calculus again, that's the day she would leave. So but we got through it.
I'm just trying to imagine working retail and taking those 2 classes at the same time.
It was not easy.
And I also want to point out that earlier in our conversation, you mentioned that you were in charge of doing a lot of the purchasing,
I did.
of product.
I
Those
did.
at least in today's market, that's a stressful thing because you have to buy the fertilizer at the right time in the market. So
Yeah,
you've got experience doing that too.
And
I
this is
do.
also a time without cell phones.
Right. Yeah, we had a radio that worked periodically in a big tower so that you could get out. Even when I was taking samples up near north of Waseca, not, let me see, 50 miles, 60 miles south of Chicago. How far away was that? 60, 70 miles. You could still talk on the radio most of the time. So really important, I got to put out the fire kind of thing, you would do that. But when I was in class, when I was at university, there was no way. There's no cell phones. So yeah, it was hard. But the boss's son, knew enough to kind of keep things going most of the time. It was more the customer service really that kind of suffered during that time. They hired some kids to try to do what I did, but even though I wasn't in a farm, I just seemed to connect. I don't know how or why or whatever, but I just seemed to connect, and so people trusted me. We've been through a lot. We've been through the drought of the '80s together and all that stuff, and so people kind of trusted me. And the people that were put in to try to fill the gaps where they just didn't have the foundation. They didn't didn't know what I knew, or I don't know, didn't work out. So that was the hardest part for the company, I think. But I needed to do this, and really after I graduated, it was 6 months later, something like that. So anyway, I graduated in '93, and by the spring of summer, maybe a year after that, he sold to Sahigro, which then sold to Growmark, and that's part of Growmark now. The family owns every American-made car you can think of in the Champaign Grand Tool area.
All of those like car dealerships.
They can wax whatever they sell.
Maybe he's waxing that old Camaro from back in the day.
That would just be sad.
That would be sad.
It was a great car.
So I think this is a really good place to kind of split the conversation. It was a pleasure hearing about the history of like, where did grid sampling come from? That's always been something I've wondered and didn't realize that it was part of coming up with a field average, not necessarily putting together points to do variable rate, which makes sense, right? We just didn't have the equipment and like the GPS to tell us where we are in the field to do that kind of precise applications, even though you yourself and your growers all knew that there was variability out in the field.
And I really enjoyed hearing about how the beginning of your career and getting through. I worked in egg retail too. And so I really enjoyed hearing about how your career started out, how you got interested. I think it's also proof to anybody that's out there that you don't have to grow up on a farm to be involved in agriculture and want to be in agriculture. You never know where you're going to find that spark for interest. And it's just great that you served agriculture, not only in academia, but also in the egg retail, because those relationships with farmers are so special. And it is a special way of working with farmers as well.
And I think we'll probably see how that's really influenced your career here at North Dakota State too. Those relationships you made with farmers, your experience of understanding the practical side of things in terms of being able to see what these challenges are on the field level and helping really bring science to the ground and improve farmers' lives.
So until next time, at GK Technology,
we have a map
and an app for that.
No, I can't wait to get in the fields again.
Let the geeks at GK Technology help you with your agricultural data. Their agronomists know agriculture. When it comes to creating soils and zone maps to maximize yields in your fields, you can trust the people with decades of experience in site-specific agriculture. Everyone at GK Technology has a background in agriculture, so they know what makes a farm run, and they speak your language. The geeks at GK Technology have a map and an app for that.